today we are going to talk about very unique and interesting and surprising even subject which is happening in the music industry today, which is streaming fraud. Has anyone heard about the streaming fraud? Raise your hand. Okay.
Some hands.
All right. And amongst all of you who heard about it, is it actually a headache for you, or it's just the news? Oh, all right. That's good. We are going to cover that subject with Morgan Hayduk of Beatdap. He's the CEO of that company. And before we start, why don't you define the streaming fraud from the point of your company's perspective?
It's a good place to start.
Yeah.
Even before that, thanks to Jasper and the whole branded team, we've been here the last couple of Septembers. It's special to be here for the inaugural CreatorWeek, and thanks to Jay for coming down from Seoul to moderate today. So before I give my definition of streaming fraud, I'm going to talk a little bit about just the company quickly. If you want to know the whole origin story, come find me after, hopefully over a Heineken, and I'll give you the whole backstory. But suffice to say, we spend almost all of our time as a team of about 50 data scientists, engineers, operations professionals, almost all technical, thinking about streaming fraud. And we think it's a really important cause, and we're going to talk a lot about why today. But a number of the definitions I've heard on this topic sort of feel incomplete to me. They either ascribe way too much responsibility to artists, which when I look at the data, it just doesn't bear out that way. Or they trivialize the nature of who's behind it, the sort of visual of a hacker in his basement, one guy sitting behind a computer in the dark, and that's just not what this is. So when I think about streaming fraud, I think about it like this. It's the use of bots, stolen accounts, or the manipulation of platform features to either alter the commercial perception of an artist or to steal legitimate revenue from a platform and from all of the artists and individuals who earn their living in streaming and in music. It's the latter that's the most important part to us. I think we're going to talk about the motivations, why people commit streaming fraud a little bit today, and there's a combination of things, financial motivation and perception, but financial is what weighs out, and it's the thing that is, truly stealing from everyone who's legitimately earning their living in the business.
How large is the size of the fraudulent cases against the total revenue?
That's the most important question. So we wouldn't have built this business if it wasn't a really big problem. At the lowest end of the range, we think it's about 5%, but truthfully, I think it's closer to 10% of all streams that are fraud. What that means in dollar terms, every point of global market share is worth about $200 million US today. So at the low end of the range, we're talking about $1 billion a year leaving, the industry, and at the top of the range, it's $2 billion a year. It's a big problem, it's growing, and it's growing sort of commensurate with the growth of the industry as a whole. And that's both concerning, but also, an opportunity to recognize this is a big problem and we can do something about it.
A lot of money.
A lot of money.
Yeah, okay. And how does it actually affect all the stakeholders in the value chain, DSPs, distributors, labels, and artists, and all that? Can you share with us?
Yeah, so let me start with, because it's Creator Week, I think it's appropriate to start with the artist, which in some ways is the toughest group to talk about because they're the most affected by the problem and the least capable of addressing it in a lot of ways. And what I mean by that is, as dollars leave the system, particularly financially motivated dollars, it affects market share. It shifts the pot. It shifts the pot of money allocated to artists. But any individual artist on their own, there's very little that they can do to try to combat, quote unquote, combat streaming fraud, save for not participating in it themselves. But it's taking dollars away from them, and it's hard to make a living. There's going to be a ton of sessions over the next couple of days and a bunch of great performances, and I think to a person, everyone would tell you, making a living in the music industry is hard. And when it's good, but it can be really difficult. And so to have theft happening at an industrial scale that affects every artist who's trying to do the right thing, to promote their career the right way and earn a living, is brutal. And so, a lot of the reason why we feel as passionately about this business as we do is because we want to be champions of all the artists who are trying their best to make a living in music, big and small. So that's the artist perspective, and we can talk about how to avoid getting caught up in streaming fraud as an artist a little bit later. Obviously for the labels, it's similar, it's just in aggregate, right? If the denominator is shrinking of the pie that's distributed to, the royalty pie is denominator shrinking. Labels make more money. If you remove fraud, labels make more money. Big labels, small labels, it doesn't matter. It affects everybody proportionally by the market share that they have today. And that's a good thing, I might add. But obviously labels care deeply because market share is critical, and it doesn't matter which market we're talking about. The royalty model being primarily pro rata, for as long as that's the case, this will be the case. And I think we can also talk about what royalty models affect fraud. My belief is that if there was an economic system that got rid of fraud, someone would have found it by now. It's more like a human condition problem. It's not going away. However we distribute the revenue, there's going to be challenges with fraud. But for labels, who are receiving primarily pro rata revenue, taking fraud out of the equation is good for market share. For the platforms, sort of three things I want to highlight. First, obviously, is their relationship with rights holders. It's important to pay the right people the right amounts of money. Fraud obviously needs to be removed from sales reports before payments go out, and they care deeply about making sure that every legitimate rights holder that they are paying is paid the right amount. That's, from a platform perspective, I think one of the overarching and most important goals. The second is the user experience. Have had a couple of conversations just over the last day or two about the importance of algorithmic recommendations and charts. And one of the things that fraud affects is both recommendations to users and, in some cases, the charts themselves. In an industry where perception matters, where what's served in what order on a playlist really matters, fraud can degrade a user experience in a way that it's hard to come back from a platform. Once a user sort of thought to themselves, I'm getting crappy recommendations, they may consider going to another platform. The last thing you want as a platform is to be dealing with churn because your recommendations aren't great. So that's sort of part and parcel. The third, and I think the most important piece, is the sort of security of the account holders themselves. So one of the vectors of attack that we're seeing more of, I talked at the beginning about the definition being bots or stolen accounts. Bots are obvious. Computer programs pretending to be real users, playing songs over and over again on streaming services. Account theft is the sort of growing vector that we're seeing across the DSPs that we look at. And it's really easy to get your hands on account credentials. And so from a platform's perspective, if you have real users whose accounts have been hacked, you want to get the hackers off that account and get the real user as sort of the sole user of the account as quickly as possible. One of the things that we help do is detect when those accounts have been stolen, flag that for the platforms, and then get the credentials back in the hands of the rightful users. So from a platform perspective, it's paying the right people, it's quality of recommendations, and it's also the security of their account holders. Sorry, that was a long answer, and I can keep going. But
apart from those three things you mentioned about DSPs, the service providers, are there any other pain points like devouring the internal resources or something like that to solve the problem?
Yeah, this is, I'm going to borrow this from when Amazon launched AWS. They used to talk about this idea of undifferentiated heavy lifting, the idea that every business that was working with their, before the cloud was the cloud and sort of ubiquitous, when people were running servers on-prem, it wasn't their core job to manage a server farm. It was just something they had to do whatever job they actually did for customers. And so AWS did what he called undifferentiated heavy lifting. It was the muck. It was, we're going to run cloud computing for you so you can go back to online banking or running a streaming service or whatever it might be. I view fraud detection as similar, obviously on a much smaller scale than the global market for cloud computing, but the idea that there are a whole bunch of stakeholders in the industry, all of which are affected by fraud, but all of which actually have much more sort of core jobs to do on a day-to-day basis, serving artists, working in labels, whatever it might be. Finding fraud is not sort of central to their job. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy and effort, and it doesn't go away. It's not like you just solve for it tomorrow and then never have to deal with it again. So yeah, one of the core benefits I think of what we do is we want to live in that muck. That's what we live for. We want to be the company that is thinking about and mitigating fraud every day, all day, for as far into the future as streaming continues to exist and music remains popular. So hopefully forever. And that's a huge benefit, I think, to anybody who's right now spending any amount of time thinking about fraud when that isn't their core business objective.
Okay, so let's dive into the actual services that Beatdap is offering. What kind of technology or tools are you using to fight against this fraudulent activity?
I mean, thanks to OpenAI, everything has been rebranded AI. I think of us more as a machine learning company, which is probably a distinction without a lot of difference at this point. But last year alone, we looked at about 2.8 trillion streams and about 25 to 30 trillion streaming data points. It takes large models to look through that much data. The industry is churning out, almost double that annually and growing in terms of streaming volume. I think it'll be close to 6 billion or 6 trillion streams this year. So you need massive models capable of looking at just literally hundreds of billions, if not trillions of data points at a time to try to tease out anomalies. So that's what we do. Our secret sauce isn't really that secret. We've looked at a lot of data. We've tuned models to a very specific use case, which is music streaming. And our goal is to find anomalies in that data that aren't necessarily perceptible to the human eye, or that you couldn't realistically with just Excel and or knowledge of SQL find on your own. And so that's the core. I mean, the two sort of, I think, special things that we do, one is just our ability to ingest all of that data in a way that makes it easy for our partners. You're talking about just a lot of volume to manage. We've made that process, the data engineering side, really easy. And then the output of our models, we've really strayed away from like what I would call black box machine learning. We tell you what we've found and why we've found it. And I think that's super important because when you think about the conversation that sort of comes from streaming fraud, it's not like we just deliver analysis and then that's the end of it. Somebody who sees our reporting has to go to somebody else who notionally owns that music and say, you're not getting paid for this because Beatdap says it's fraud. It's really important for our customers to be armed not just with here's the confidence score, but also here are the flags associated with that specific bad behavior that we're calling you out for. It drives the conversation. It lets them have like an actual informed conversation. It's not one-sided where it just says, we found something bad. We're not going to tell you what it is, but now you have to deal with the consequences.
Okay. Is your platform or service able to deal with the real-time monitoring or real-time thing?
So this is, I think, one of the most unique parts about fraud in the music industry compared to other industries that deal with it. If you're in digital advertising, banking, e-commerce, you have to deal with fraud immediately as it happens because you're making a decision about whether a purchase is going to go through on a credit card or whether an ad is going to be served to a user or not. Music has this built-in lag, right? There's 30 days or so before we make a payout on the recorded side, sometimes longer, much longer on publishing. But the advantage to that is it lets us do detection sort of looking back retroactively over the month and make a decision before the first sales report is issued for the previous month. I hope that doesn't go away. I mean, there's a lot of interest in moving towards real-time payments. I'm sure for some of the artists in the room, getting paid faster in an industry that has historically not always paid very quickly is really important. But one of the advantages that a bit of a slower payment cycle affords us is the ability to look back and be very thorough in our examination of every single one of those streams by every single one of those users on every device that they've consumed from, and be very precise about what we're calling fraud and what we're not. So from my perception, real time isn't necessary, and thankfully it's not, because it's actually what allows us to be thorough. We do our analysis on a daily basis, and we feed some of our clients daily analysis to inform their charts, both internal and external, and also their algorithmic playlists. But generally, the sort of core report that we deliver at the end of the month comes at the end of the month in time for sales cycles that are on a monthly basis. And I hope in a lot of ways that doesn't change because it lets us be very precise.
Okay. What kind of preventive measures can artists or labels can take to utilize your product and to fight against them?
So we talked earlier about it's hard to make a living in music, and I think sometimes, earlier it might have been Calvin from Universal who referenced the 150,000 songs a day that are being uploaded. I think that's 55-ish million songs a year, if my math is right. That's an insane amount of volume to cut through for an artist, big or small. And what happens with the motivation to use something like streaming fraud, and maybe you're not outright searching how do I commit streaming fraud, but you're Googling as an artist, how do I get more streams, or how do I guarantee placement on a playlist? There are lots of these tactics that they feel like they live in the gray, and they're going to help you cut through all of that noise. And my advice to artists is always the same. It's if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And if someone is promising you guaranteed playlist placements on the most visible playlists on a streaming service or guaranteed numbers of streams, they're promising you fraud. And it's bullshit, and you shouldn't pay for it. And you should be very careful when you're deciding amongst marketing and sort of service vendors who are helping you with promotions to not inadvertently buy streams. And so ask for references. There's nothing wrong if you're meeting a new vendor who's telling you that promising you the world. Ask them for references. What other artists have they worked with? Tell me about the success that you had with them. Look at their website through the lens of someone who's evaluating a website that you might give your credit card information to. If it looked like it was designed in 1997, not to pick on unaesthetic things, but if it looks like it was designed in 97, ask for 4 references, not just 2. I've seen a bunch of sites where to the not even trained eye, just it strains belief that this is a legitimate landing page for a legitimate service, and yet the artist who brought it to me spent $25,000 with this company to buy a bunch of streams that ended up getting their music removed from one of the big platforms, which was a career-limiting move for them. So if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. Be really careful and sort of evaluate judiciously marketing services firms and anyone who's offering you guaranteed placement or guaranteed streams. They're just, you're going to get caught, and for a smaller artist, unfortunately, that can be career-limiting or career-ending.
The next question is, how critical do you think is collaboration among all the stakeholders about this matter to fight against fraudulent activity?
So, I mean, going back to something we sort of touched on earlier, there's a really important role for everybody to play around awareness, right? It's cool to look out and see a bunch of hands shoot up at the beginning when we ask who's heard of streaming fraud. I guarantee you 2 years ago, there were 0 hands. And 3 years ago, when we really got going on this, we were actually having to like beg, borrow, and steal to get anybody to acknowledge there was a problem in the first place. So awareness to me is the #1 role of everybody in the industry. It's not a bad thing to admit we have a problem. Like, that's the first step towards solving it. I was reading JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan released a quarterly letter here a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about hiring 2,000 data scientists at JP Morgan, and the first thing that they were going to work on was fraud. And it's kind of encouraging, from my perspective, again, who lives in like the lane of fraud all the time, to see something as blue chip and legitimate as JP Morgan acknowledging in the first paragraph of their quarterly letter that dealing with fraud is one of the core jobs of their data science team. So as an industry, we can say it too. It's not a dirty word. We should work on that. So awareness is sort of key for everybody. The place where I draw a pretty big distinction is between awareness and actually solving the problem. I'm horribly biased. I'm up here, as the founder of a company that finds fraud. So I'm not going to pretend like my view is completely impartial. But what I can tell you is my company is completely impartial. We raised, when we started the business, from non-strategic investors. We have no music industry folks on our cap table. We've always viewed ourselves as neutral and a true arbiter of balls and strikes. I think when you look at other verticals affected by fraud, you will see a similar thing emerge where companies that are neutral and impartial sort of stand up between competitors and do the analysis for them. And it's really important that when you talk about getting away from awareness and getting towards actually solving the problem, you have a neutral third party that sits between a bunch of very competitive other parties and can be a fair, transparent adjudicator of what should get paid and what shouldn't. So I think there's a role for everybody in the industry. I think fundamentally our role is quite unique. Music isn't a big enough market for there to be 10 of us. So I think the thing that keeps me up at night is winning as quickly as possible, is to become the standard for the industry and make sure that we don't have, to the extent possible, any competition in music. But I think it's really important that there is somebody who sits in the middle and adjudicates, what should get paid and what shouldn't, and that it isn't coming from one side of the industry or another. That's not to say that anybody has, bad intent. It's just when you're in the business, you're protecting your interest in the business. And I view this as a really important place for someone who's neutral to sit and say, I'm not, I don't have a home team. I'm like, there's no favorite here. It's just what the data shows us, and it's all in the service of making sure that every artist who's earning a living in music is paid correctly.
Okay, let's look at this issue from a different angle. I still remember those MP3 days, and the legal system or regulations fighting against it. And usually, actually most of the time, the legal structure is lagging behind the advancement of the technology. So in those days, back in Korea, governments and everybody was all hands tied up, so they could do nothing to kill it or fight against it. So what do you think is the current legal and regulatory frameworks in place right now? And do you think it's adequate and any room to grow, advance?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about spending time in the fraud space is you spend time in other industries, fraud conferences as well. And one thing that's unique to music right now, and I hope stays this way for a long time to come, is that when we have a trust and safety symposium, as we did earlier this year in New York, as a sort of an industry, it didn't start with a panel or a presentation by someone from a three-letter agency that we would all probably recognize, like the SEC or the IRS or some other equally toothy, law enforcement body or quasi-regulatory body. We're in a position to self-regulate and self-govern on this, and I think we should do everything in our power to keep it that way, because there's nothing as an industry that I would like to see less than 185 different interpretations of the definition of streaming fraud applied to every platform operating in every market everywhere around the world. That's a horrifying cost of compliance nightmare scenario that I would very much like to see us avoid. So in the interim, there are two things to keep in mind. One, just because there isn't a regulator of streaming doesn't mean that when you have large amounts of money flowing through global financial networks, they aren't regulated. There are three-letter agencies in countries all over the world, but most notably the US, who are monitoring flows of capital through platforms. And if, as earlier this year was reported, streaming fraud is also a conduit for money laundering, there are certainly agencies that are interested in how that's happening, why it's happening, where that money is flowing, and they have plenty of teeth in the regulations that empower them to investigate and sort of, compel testimony and other things. So we are regulated. We just aren't regulated with an office of streaming, and I hope to keep it that way, but let's not forget that there are regulators who are keeping an eye on this. The other thing that I think is really important, and we actually just announced this yesterday, is there are sort of two sides to the coin of what we do. One is detection, which we've talked a lot about today. The other is enforcement. And so we've partnered with a law firm, a leading firm out of Washington, D.C., that's one of the partners that we're working with was the former head of white-collar crimes at the U.S. Department of Justice. The advantage of partnering with them is for our clients, when we detect cases of streaming fraud that exceed $1 million in total value, we can, through IFRA, refer those cases into the U.S. Department of Justice for investigation. And I think that enforcement side is a huge part of the deterrence factor here, because the people who are behind this are not unsophisticated. It is the same criminals who are targeting PayPal and Google and every e-commerce platform on the planet and everyone else. And so we need to make an example of some of the worst offenders and make it very clear that this is not something the industry tolerates. But I hope that's all done effectively by us as an industry and not compelled by some, angry, toothy, state-level regulator who tells us how to solve the problem.
Okay. How many years since the inception of the company?
We've been at this for really 3 years, focused on streaming fraud. Like a lot of startups, we had the wrong idea at first, and we survived just long enough to find the right one.
Okay.
And so we've been around for 5 years and change, but really focused on streaming fraud for the last 3.
I see. Can you share with us any meaningful results so far working with your customer, or best practices you can share with us today?
There's a bunch more sort of on the announceable front to come that I can't share today. I share the Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan story in hopes that it persuades some of our existing customers to let us talk more freely about who they are and the results that we've had for them. But the one thing that I'm really proud of is that we have yet to have someone come back to us with an allegation of a false positive, i.e. if we've called it fraud, it's been proven to be fraud. And that we take that really seriously. I mean, our head of data science definitely loses sleep over the idea that we could inadvertently punish a legitimate artist in our reporting. And so we take that very seriously, and we've yet to have an allegation of a false positive, and we've gone as far as to put an insurance policy in place that says if we call something fraud and it's found out later in an audit that we were wrong, that loss is on us, not on our client. Okay. And so we want to put our money where our mouth is and say, you know, if we're going to be in the business of saying this is what you should pay and this is what you shouldn't, it's not, you know, it's not enough just to be neutral and stand back and say the rest is for you to deal with. We're actually on the hook for the liability of being wrong. And I think that's a really important sort of position to take so that all of our customers and anyone who works with our customers knows we're really trying to get this 100% right every time.
Okay. I believe you are currently focusing on North American market and the global majors. Do you have any plan to come to Asian market?
We would love to. I mean, I'm here, and this is the last 2 years in September, and obviously this May. You know, the explosive growth of streaming globally, and what we're seeing in sort of the Asia Pacific region, it would, you know, it would be irresponsible not to be here and not to be developing client relationships in the market. I mean, I think about Korea as an example. You know, you were as early on streaming as the folks in Sweden were, right? Like it's it's a little known fact, but there's you know the timeline is actually pretty much concurrent.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're going to spend a lot more time here because we view this as a global issue, and the value of streaming in the Asia Pacific region is growing year over year at an explosive rate that's outpacing the growth in the U.S. right now. So. Yeah, we're going to spend more time here, and we're really excited to build up relationships with customers in the APAC region.
Okay, before we get questions from the floor, my last question to you, what's the next step and vision for Beatdap, say 3 to 5 years to come? What's the project initiatives you are thinking of right now?
So, as a founder who has a market in our grasp that I think we have a good chance of winning, I usually just say winning this market is the answer. And the truth is, I mean, we want to stay laser focused. We want to win as much business as possible in this space and ultimately be the platform of choice for anybody who has concerns with streaming fraud, whether it's the platforms, the distributors, the labels, emerging tech platforms. We're doing some work with some of the AI generative music companies. So there's a lot to do in the next 12 to 18 months to just win this vertical. Longer term, there's sort of two paths I think we can go down. One is we'll find something else in music that's sort of built upon the data set that we have. I think auditing is a really interesting space for us if we're already in the business of saying what should be paid and what shouldn't. Getting sort of deeper into sort of the audit value chain for rights holders is interesting.
Expansion of the auditing activity, right?
Exactly. And then the other thing is, 5 years from now, someone says, what's Beatdap do? And we say, we find fraud, and we've just sort of dropped in the music industry from it. That's also really interesting to me. I think a lot of the models that we've developed lend themselves nicely to large sort of time series sets of data where you're trying to find inconsistencies, and there are lots of technically underserved markets that would benefit from that. So we'll start to dabble a little bit outside of music, but for the next 12 to 18 months, I want to stay laser focused on doing the best possible job we can for the customers we have and earning the business of everybody that we haven't yet had the opportunity to serve.
Okay, thank you. I think we have 15 seconds left. Can we have a question from the floor? Okay.
If there are any. Calvin.
Do you need a microphone? Okay.
I think, obviously, I mentioned about fraud as well in my little session just now. We talk about the whack-a-mole versus prevention. I mean, would Beatdap be of use for such DIY platforms to ensure that legitimate content actually get posted rather than, the person go in there, pay the subscription, and then have to take it down, but they've paid $20 or whatever for it. Is there any way for that to be prevented, so people don't have to pay, and then to realize that, because musicians sometimes sample some people's songs or use illegitimate tools to create the music. Is there any way Beatdap can support that?
It's such a good question. The detection, and I think really, all right, the detection of, on upload, what the provenance or genesis or origin of a song is a question that's getting batted around by a lot of places right now, largely because of, OpenAI and other large language models creating music. We haven't tried to get into the sort of prevention space, partly because I'm not sure you'll ever really be able to say, given how digitally processed all music is now, whether something is AI generative or not, unless you have some sort of flag in the training set or some sort of proactive disclosure on the part of the creator, and there's no guarantee that that's going to happen. So what we focus on instead is in the data that the platforms spit out related to what's being listened to and by whom, can we detect the tracks that have been generated either by AI or created by legitimate creators that are the targets for fraud and get those off the platform. So it's still retroactive, but it's still serving that problem. If enough volume is being directed at a track that's fraudulent, we should get it off the platform as quickly as possible. I'm hopeful that there's going to be some detection capabilities around AI generative music, but I'm not holding out a lot of hope because the smartest people that I know in that space don't feel like it's actually very likely to happen anytime soon. That's probably all the time we have.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.